Okay. So once you get 90% on one exam, 90% on the other, consistently, you're ready to go. How much do you have to test that? How confident do you want to feel walking into the exam, right? That's really the only litmus test. Other question I got, other than getting 90% on the 2 exams and training for that, is, if you're really strong on the ML side of things, then you don't need to worry about as much as diving into all the little details around all the ML related stuff. If you're not strong on the AWS side of things, that's probably when those papers are going to actually become more relevant. But again, you're still going to skim them because it's not like you need to know every single little detail about all the features of S3 in order to pass the ML exam. They're going to test your superficial knowledge, right? So, but obviously, if you're not strong in ML, right, you're going to want to parse through all of that, and including SageMaker. Okay. Let's see. I saw something flash on chat, but I wasn't sure what that was for a second.
I raised my hand.
Oh, hi, Darcy. What's going on?
With Tutorials Dojo, it has a cost associated. So, like, is there a coupon, or did you go over that and I missed it?
Yeah. So in the student portal, if you go to WebAid Solutions, click on Contact and go to Student Login. You can log in using your email address that you registered for the class with. And so, and you should have gotten an email on this in your inbox, hopefully. So, and then when you log in here and you actually click on the machine learning class, right at the bottom here, it'll say, well, there's accessing your voucher, but accessing your practice exams. If you download that link on the student portal, it should open up a Word file, and there's a little code right there. That code and the instructions that you have there will allow you to get the practice exams.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Got it.
Yeah. Yeah. No worries. Yeah, no, we'll give them to, we're getting them to you. I often joke, I was like, hey, people are like, but it's just $15. I was like, hey, it's $15 you don't have to pay. So yeah, it's worth it. We're trying to make it easy for you. Okay, so in case that wasn't clear, 90% on 2 exams. And then, pick and choose out of the certification study guide where only where your strengths or weaknesses are, right? As it relates to ML versus AWS versus SageMaker. Those are really kind of the 3 poles, really. So, adjust accordingly. You don't need to digest every single piece of information in there unless you just don't know it. If you know it, then move on. Okay. One other thing that I was asked at this point, I don't want to put fear in anybody's life, but if you're prone to like panic or like lots of last minute stress, just go ahead and stress now. Like just get on it now, and then that way as you get 2 weeks into your closer to your exam, it'll take you less time. But like you want to double down now, right? Like I said, the gentleman last week who took the exam right after taking the class, that's probably Jim Hutchins, I think it was, or Hutchins. That was the first time that's ever happened. So, but you want to double down now. So again, if you're good on the ML stuff, good on AWS stuff, you might actually just end up going straight to the practice exams and then learning those, using those as a learning tool. Be very careful. If you think that you're going to come in here and memorize the practice exams, that's not going to work. It's not going to help you, right? So not as much as you want it to. So just make sure you're still learning the rights and the wrongs and filling in your gaps, okay? All right, any questions there? Okay. All right, so let's talk about this. You know what? I don't think I really need you there, so I hit the wrong button. Let's do that. Okay. All right, so data engineers designing a solution for customer data analysis using Athena. An on-premise application produces data as CSV files in near real time. The engineer needs to convert the data to Apache Parquet format before saving it on an S3 bucket. I think we did this yesterday. We'll see it again. Okay, so give me the pinnacle reason as to why C is the answer. What is the distinguishing mark there? There's 2 conditions here that make C the answer as far as data streams and glue. Okay, good. So Firehose will not ingest a CSV and then convert it over to Parquet, but it'll do JSON, right? Good. So that justifies Glue. Why are we using data streams? Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Be clear. When you can I say this? Can I say like when you can, which is about 90, yeah, I don't know, 5% of the time. I feel like 1 every 20 questions is going to be exactly like you saw in the assessment, where it's going to be like, that's really squishy justification, Amazon. But this time it's really clear. We need real time, and we have some conversion limitations. So Glue's going to be our friend. Okay. Now, I just made all that up. I could be completely and utterly wrong. It could be another answer, but there is. And then, yeah, we did see this yesterday, didn't we? By the way, if you know anything about Glue, good cheat sheet here, right? So worth checking out. Cheat sheet should be like a memorization sheet. Sorry, it gives the exact opposite answer. It says to use Kinesis Data Firehose.
Yeah, and I took the exam on Sunday, got that question wrong. The explanation said to use Firehose because Firehose does conversion and Glue does not. Conversion to Parquet.
Huh. Yeah, that's not accurate. I can tell you, like, having done that, that's not accurate, actually. Don't get me wrong. Firehose will convert into Parquet, but it will not source from a CSV file. So, yeah. Yeah. Again, yeah, I think that's why we're loving these practice exams. But I mean, we can go look at the documentation, right, to justify that approach. I think it very clearly says that in there that it won't do it, right?
Yep,
So,
just in when
but
doing the exams didn't look at the documentation. So
yeah, but I also will say this. I can't imagine having this, right? Because that stuff changes all the time. Like, even as I said that, right, we could go look at the doc. Well, like Jack just put it up. Let's go take a look at it. We could look at the documentation. It could be completely wrong, right? Let's see. This is data fire hose. Yeah. All right. So notice that you have to put lambda in it first if you want to do another format like CSVs or other structured text, right? That's a pretty clear statement. So, and they will, by the way, do that on occasion. We'll ask you to throw lambdas in front of something. So I saw that in one. I think that might have been, though, a practice question. I didn't see that on the exam. So, yeah. But, you know, like I said, you know, this changes all the time. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some squishiness around the last time maybe some of those things have been updated. Okay. Okay. ML specialist is preparing a sandbox environment for the data analytics team to access notebooks and train models in SageMaker. The admin should be able to track and record the number of deployments performed, the utilization of the CPUs and GPUs of the SageMaker instances, as well as the number of invocation errors. Where are the two places you would go, right, to actually track metrics and to see the number of times that a SageMaker job was invoked, right, through a notebook? Okay, so just to clarify this, CloudWatch seems pretty intuitive, right? Because this would be metrics. So that one like makes a lot of sense. But why is everybody saying CloudTrail? What is CloudTrail's security function? What does CloudTrail actually log? Okay, good, Luke. So it tracks API calls. Let me ask you this, Angela. Awesome. Who cares? Why would API calls be relevant? Excuse me for 1 second. Why would API calls be relevant here? Like, we've been working out of notebooks. What have we been doing the entire time when we interact with SageMaker? Daniel. Yep. So if you want to see what someone's doing in a notebook and number of invocations and whatnot, and you want to see who's calling what and all that, like that's going to be the answer. Now, I'm just going to explain the rest of these just really quickly. X-ray is a tracing tool. So while it will give you detailed information end to end about an application from the front end web service all the way to the back end data store and all the AWS services in between, it's not really a metrics tool. It's like a session tracing tool, really, although it will do all the sessions, not just one session. Inspector is a vulnerability assessment tool. So it basically does a scan of operating systems from a network perspective and internally to see if they have known vulnerabilities. So that's not going to apply here. And then config is one of the worst named services. Config just tracks configuration. It doesn't actually do configuration. It just tracks configuration. So you can actually set certain rules or states of your AWS account. Like you don't want anybody to run, for example, virtual machines that are open to the world. You can actually have rules that config will track. And so if someone configures their system to all of a sudden be open to the world, that will trigger either an alert or a response because someone can actually lock the system down if it does that. So I just want you to know CloudWatch and CloudTrail are clear answers because of the API calls and the metrics, but the other ones by exclusion are also just off the table because X-ray is tracing, vulnerability assessment is what Inspector does, and config tracks configuration changes inside of your AWS account and notifies against them. Cool. And by I'm always open to, sometimes I go through that whole spiel and what I think is the answer is like completely unjustified. Anyway, so because I missed a key word or something because I didn't read the question. Yeah. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions there? Okay. Okay. ML specialist created a hyperparameter tuning job on a notebook instance. The tuning job will use the built-in XGBoost algorithm to train a classification model. They want to visualize the correlation of ETA, alpha, max depth, and min child weight hyperparameters with the model's performance at each iteration so she can reconfigure them to attain the best model version. In doing so, the time and cost it takes to train the model will decrease. Which visualization technique should the ML specialist use? Well, first of all, what are we not going to use here? A is out. B didn't make any sense, right? We're all clear on that, right? You guys can't see it, but someone proposed D, right? Scatter plot for AUC. Let's take a look. So here we are, basically, we're showing how one variable affects another, right? Now, I gotta tell you, the correlation of all of these hyperparameters with each model's performance at each iteration, right? Okay, kind of makes sense, right? So, you have to train a classification model. Obviously, we want to use area under the curve, or has a possibility, but that is the strongest out of the ones that were offered. Then we can use a grid scatter plot if we want to show the correlation between these like iterations of hyperparameter like sets, if you will, and the area under the curve, right, metric. So then in that way, you could actually use the scatter plot appropriately. Now, a little softer here. Obviously, this isn't going to work. Histograms are just used for data distribution. That's relatively true, right? You cannot visualize correlation with TCA. That's not even an appropriate way to use that because TCA is really used for like PCA for reducing dimensionality, right? So that doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, if you did do that, obviously that would slow down the training time. But was there any like characteristics about that? Yeah. So we want the time to train the model to decrease. If we add t-SNE into the equation in any form or fashion, that's not going to increase it. So questions there? What you might get hung up on is that there's 5 different, well, 1, 2, 3, 4 different hyperparameters that we're tuning for, but there's an iteration, meaning there's a set where the parameters are set at a certain value, and that's one iteration of the run. There's another change of the 4 parameters, and that's another iteration. So you can actually compare the iteration against the AUC. So just make sure that's clear. Okay. Research team is training a custom PyTorch model in SageMaker. They want to implement a solution where each member will be alerted through email notifications when the model is overfitting. So now, this is Amazon's official answer, by the way. If you want to trigger a notification, you're going to use what service inside of AWS? I'm not saying you couldn't use something else, but what service, right? So good, SNS. So that's the simple notification service, not SES, just so we're clear. SES is a simple email service that's used for bulk email. Ignore that. You can even forget that I even said it. SNS will send emails, text, mobile pushes, whatever. So first of all, if they ask you a question on an AWS exam about sending a notification, just be aware that regardless of what the ask is, Amazon is, I don't think they've ever actually recommended a third party. It's always going to be an AWS service because, right? They're training us to think a certain way as well. So in this particular case, if you look at one, create a CloudWatch event rule that triggers a Lambda function when the model's overfitting, use the Amazon SNS APIs within the function and send email notifications. So just to say this, my first question is how are the metrics from the training job going to get into CloudWatch? Because it is a custom model. It's a custom model, right? It's not a built-in model. It's a custom model. So what needs to happen now, because we brought a custom model to the equation, which means we're using our own code and we're using our own like custom PyTorch model, we are going to have to emit metrics. Now, what is the simplest place for us to emit metrics? If we've written our own code and we're using our own model, if we're writing our own application, how do we emit metrics? Where do we do that from? No, we don't have to retrieve the metrics, Spencer. Where do we actually push metrics out? Like we can actually push them out. Where can we do that at? If this was just a straight up application, how would we emit metrics? Yeah. So Ian and Luke down that path, right? So we can actually push metrics from our code directly into CloudWatch, right? And we could do it on an operating system the same way. We can push metrics into AWS. So one thing to remember is that AWS by default can see metrics about a service, but if you are doing something in an application or a custom framework, or even in some cases specifically inside of an operating system, AWS can't see that. It can only see services that it natively runs. If you customize something, you have to emit metrics. So then we've solved 2 problems here, right? We have to use the CloudWatch API within whatever code we've written. And we now know we're probably going to use SNS for that, right? Because Amazon always recommends a service if they have one to solve whatever problem like notifications. And I know you're like, Michael, that was a really long explanation, but I want you to understand, because if you miss that custom PyTorch model, you might think, oh, you know what, it's already in CloudWatch, but it's not, because you have a custom model. So if you do anything custom by default, it's not going to emit metrics. Okay. So with that in mind, we now know that our code, our script that we wrote, now needs to basically talk to the API to deliver metrics to CloudWatch. So that solves the emission problem. And then from there, we can just actually set a threshold using a CloudWatch alarm, which if like, you know, depending on which way we want to go, whether the number's too low or the number's too high, right? In this case, probably too low. Well, actually, I have no idea. I don't know. That was an assumption. So you create a CloudWatch alarm that says, hey, if you cross this threshold in either direction, I want you to send a notification. And then what you can do is you can then, with SNS, by the way, since it works like an email subscription, you can just have all the members' emails just subscribe to the topic. And so when you publish the alarm, it just hits the topic and that fans it out to everybody who subscribes. Okay, that's an SNS thing, but that's how that works. So you cross the CloudWatch alarm threshold, it sends an SNS notice, which then in turn fans it out to everybody else. Oh no, Marissa, SNS is definitely not Kafka. They do have a managed Kafka option, right? So that's a streaming, what would you call that? Like a streaming data store, streaming bus. I don't know what the right second term is, but Kafka is for near real-time streaming, just like Kinesis, right? And don't get me wrong, it is pub sub. So SNS is pub sub. So if you're asking me that, yes, it is pub sub like Kafka. Yeah, 100%. The difference is that SNS is not going to hold on to the data. Once it sends it, it's just going to push it out. It's not even going to keep a copy of it. Kafka will keep it based on your retention period. So will Kinesis. So Kinesis, by the way, is like a closed source version of Kafka that Amazon started way before Kafka was popular. And Kafka, of course, is the open source version. Now, so sorry, a little tangent there. All right, so maybe I just made all that up and I'm a big liar and that's actually not the answer. So let's go check. So there it is. Okay, so that makes sense. Any part of that not make sense to anybody?
Yesterday, and I can read up on this, but yesterday you talked about the difference between CloudWatch events and CloudWatch alarms. I thought events would actually trigger a response. So why in this one can you skip CloudWatch events, creating that SNS topic?
Well, that's good. That's good, right? So alarms is what you're going to use when you want to respond to a metric change. Events is what you're going to use when you want to respond to some kind of AWS state change. That's not a metric.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Because events, by the way, could actually receive events from third parties. Like you could have Datadog or somebody else pushing into your AWS account, which could trigger the account to do something. That's an event-driven response. Or it could be because something inside of your account changed state. And so CloudWatch events was called to trigger a response. Alarms is much more narrow and is literally just used to trigger responses to metrics.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I gotta tell you, Angela, that's a great question because they will test that subtlety in the exam. Like I remember them asking me, and all the answers were two of them were CloudWatch alarms and two of them were CloudWatch events. Otherwise, they were practically the same. And so, you know, we weren't dealing with a metric that was getting crossed. So I knew the answer wasn't CloudWatch alarms. I knew it was going to be CloudWatch events. And then I had to like distinguish the second part, which I don't remember what that was. But yeah, so it's good to know that distinction. So you probably just helped everybody out on the exam by asking that question. All right, so what makes C wrong? So you write a Lambda function that uses CloudWatch API operations to deliver training metrics to the CloudWatch dashboard from the SageMaker instance. Create a CloudWatch alarm that triggers an S topic when the model is overfitting. So what's the difference? So those, let's say technically that C is correct, because it is actually. What's the difference between the two options that makes B better than C from Amazon's perspective? That's right, Luke, right on the mark. Remember that if they don't want you to throw extra services in there if you don't have to use them, because they don't want you to. Amazon's sole job is to eat operational complexity and overhead. That's their whole business model is predicated on that. So if you've got two options and there's a simpler version that uses more managed services and you've got another version that uses like, you know, lower level services or adds extra steps into the equation, Amazon doesn't want that. That's not an answer they're going to go for. They don't want you to have to do 4 steps when you could just do 3, right? So you don't need actually to call a Lambda. And to say this is that Sensor's on the mark there with that as well, is that the reason they want you to go simple is that every time you add an extra step to the equation, typically it's going to cost you money. right? And they don't want that. Daniel, a state change would be, for example, a firewall getting changed, or an EC2 instance crashing or stopping, right? It could be an API call made inside a CloudTrail, right? That actually caused the state change. It could be, the failure of a particular web server. I mean, basically, it could be anything inside of the entire AWS account. If it goes from one state to another state, right? Including configuration changes, by the way. So, although I will tell you that configuration changes tend to center in config, AWS config, which then calls CloudWatch events. So if that feels like an Inception-like rabbit hole, it is. So there's a lot of debate about when to use one over the other. And then CloudWatch event rules, not going to work because, one, it doesn't describe how you're going to get the metrics out. It doesn't say how you're going to get the metrics. This assumes that by default, you can see the SageMaker metrics. Would be totally true if you were using built-in. Right? You could probably see that job actually running because it's already going to emit metrics. Because remember, when you run the jobs, it basically told you at the beginning, it told you which ones it was going to emit out, right, to CloudWatch, right? It says that. Like when we ran a training job yesterday on the console, it said, hey, the following metrics are going to get kicked out to CloudWatch. Like, great. That's what I want. When you don't need them, you don't really care. But when you need them, it matters a whole lot as far as the metrics go. Okay. Let's do maybe one or two more and then we'll move on. So a music streaming platform is receiving complaints about artists uploading inappropriate album covers. What a surprise. Company currently relies on the combined effort of moderators and user-generated reports for content moderation. They want to streamline this process using ML learning to only flag graphic images for review. Huh. Okay. We are testing our operational complexity once again, right? Because the question literally states, which AWS service can accomplish this task with the least amount of effort? Okay, so first of all, what's Lex used for? Chatbots. Thank you, Jack. What's Polly used for? I think it's actually funny named, like Polly wants a cracker. I think that's probably one of the most appropriate name services. Yeah, text to speech. Okay, so then when it comes down to A and C, content-based filtering algorithm on SageMaker versus recognition, why is it that they say recognition is a better answer? Why is that a better answer? And I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Why is that a better answer in AWS's perspective, right? Managed service, you're not configuring your own, simpler. Just to be aware that we didn't even begin to touch the surface on this. Amazon has a ridiculous number of machine learning enabled services that are not part of the exam. So I have not brought them up because I felt like probably most of you were already overwhelmed with the number of services that you have to know for the exam. Right? But there's even more that we can talk about, right? So yeah. Let me put it this way. Maybe I was overwhelmed. Obviously, since I'm sick, I must have been overwhelmed, right? So yeah, well, that was appropriately timed cough. So yeah, so the answer is recognition just because it's easier. Okay. Anyone not understand that? Anything I need to clear up there about why recognition is the better answer from that question? This is, by the way, how they'll approach it. So just to say this, Spencer had a good point. They will throw stuff around the problem because that's kind of like what happens in real life, right? So just know they will throw stuff around the problem to kind of distract you, and you got to cut through the chaff, right, to get to what's really important. All right, one more. By the way, if you join for the machine learning exam cram next week, just know that like the first 45 minutes to an hour is going to be a repeat of stuff you've already seen, but the last 2 hours is going to be us going just through more practice exams. So If you like this kind of explanatory kind of breakdown, we're going to do this for hours next week. So, okay. We got a data set with several thousand features to train a linear regression model. Initial data visualizations show many highly correlated values. Specialist wants to reduce the number so they can visualize and understand the data easier. It's simplistic, but what will we use? As I heard my cousin the other day say, using a phrase that I had never really heard, having been in the South my entire life, he said, well, that dog don't hunt, which I found out means that idea doesn't work. So obviously using one hot encoding and matrix multiplication, not really going to be awesome. The correlation coefficient, maybe, but I don't think that that's really what we're looking for. You guys are unanimously going to D, right? So in this case, like for example, with the Pearson coefficient, it's just used for statistical relationship between variables. You can't really reduce anything with the correlation coefficient. The rest of these don't even make sense. Like matrix multiplication will reduce that, but it won't reduce highly correlated features. So that's not answering the problem. And then one hot encoding. Well, I think we've kind of beat that one to death, unfortunately. There's only so many horses, as my sister likes to say. Okay, any questions about that one? Okay, let's talk about deployment. While I am transitioning, those of you who are still working on your labs, go check on them really quick. See how they're doing. If you like you had a job working, I'm gonna roll over to the next set of slides. Stop this.